Well, hello, and welcome to our discussion of race and education, which I've titled Toward Educational Equity. My name is Leslie McKesson, and I am honored to present a few comments around this very important topic. Just to provide a brief introduction of myself and share a little bit of my positionality, if you will, where I come from. Education is my primary discipline, it's my academic discipline, and specifically higher education, adult education. A few years ago, I retired after 28 years as an instructor and academic dean with the North Carolina Community College system. So that was the bulk of my professional experience and career. From there, I went on to serve as adjunct faculty of leadership and educational studies at Lenoir-Rhyne University and Appalachian State University. So my career has been steeped in higher education. And while my primary discipline is education, I'm also a lover of history, I'm a lover of law, a lover of genealogy and family storytelling. So I take a very multidisciplinary approach to matters of race and matters of education. You'll see that reflected in my comments. My first experiences, if you will, at the intersection of racism, and education began very early in my life as I was a child of the civil rights movement. I and my classmates were the young pioneers of public school desegregation as it made its way across the South after Brown v. Board of Education. And we'll talk more about Brown v. Board in this presentation. As we talk about education, we are going to go at it from a holistic standpoint. We're going to look at education from every level, from pre-K through K-12 into higher education. I want to give you a brief overview of the points that I've decided to focus on in this talk. And there are 4 primary areas that I'll go into. Hundreds of thousands of topics that we could discuss in this very important area, just like there are in all the other areas we've discussed so far, but I've drilled in on these 4. First is the relationship between race, education, and citizenship. We're going to ground ourselves there. From then, we'll talk a little bit about generational impacts of educational deprivation. We'll transition from that into the achievement gap. I'm sure that's a term that probably everyone in this class is familiar with, has some perhaps definition of, or some sense of, some assumptions about. But we're going to talk a bit more about that, specifically as it relates to deficit discourses, and I'll define that later, in education around BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we'll finish it up by talking a little bit about critical race theory and the controversy over teaching and talking about racism in classrooms. So a few comments just to kind of set the stage for these topics. Human beings are meaning makers. That's one of the things that we believe distinguishes us from other creatures, though science is beginning to question that a little bit. We definitely navigate our world based on our ability to understand, to predict, and to control our environment. So it's very natural that we attempt to categorize things, to categorize experiences in ways that try to help us survive and ways that try to help us succeed and do well. The thing is, we don't all have the same interpretations of these situations. In fact, we don't all even have the same definitions of the separate pieces of these situations that we're trying to interpret, because we're all looking at experiences and phenomenon through our own internal lenses. So I place a lot of importance on establishing common definitions, common understandings of terms and concepts that we are going to discuss before we move forward. Words are how we communicate our thoughts. So words are critical. So let's talk about equity. The Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary defines equity as, quote, fairness or justice in the way people are treated, close quote. Now think about those two terms. Many of you have seen this meme before. It's intended to present a simplified visual distinction between the terms equity and equality, and that distinction bears a bit of discussion. The takeaway from this meme is that as a society focuses primarily on equality or giving everyone the same amount of any resource, that very equality of distribution that sounds ideal perpetuates systems of privilege that are already in place. Okay, you give 3 children of different sizes, and let's equate the size of these children to their social advantages. You give 3 children of different sizes a box that's the same size, and the graphic represents how that box positions each child to deal with the barrier they're facing, that barrier here being a gate that keeps them from seeing a baseball game. The larger child has a bird's eye, even better view of the field standing on the box. The middle child's view is okay, they can see, but the smaller child still sees nothing. The child with less inherent advantage still cannot break past the barrier. So in the second view at the right, which is the view of equity, by giving the children resources based on what enables them to overcome the particular barrier they're facing, in this image, the wall, the 3 children are placed at parity. They can all see from the same level. Equity and equality are different concepts. Okay, so equity is what's fair. Equality is what is the same. So there is a distinction there, a very clear distinction that the American courts and legal system have even recognized by creating both courts of law and courts of equity as part of our legal system. The idea here being that because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be fair, the fair outcome, the just outcome in a case. So in these situations in courts of equity, judges are given the authority and autonomy to decide based on what is equitable, what is fair, what would bring rightness to the situation. So back to the meme. If you do a Google search for equity memes, you'll find a host of other takes on the idea of equity, which is becoming sort of a hot word these days and something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. One of the memes that you'll find includes a definition of equity or defines or pictures equity as a white policeman arresting a black man. Another one of the parodies of this meme depicts equity with the larger 2 children having their bodies sawed off and a bloody saw literally in the image with them to match the size of the smaller child. The implication being that equity brings people who already have an advantage down. So definitions and lenses or frameworks or viewpoints matter. They make a difference. As I talk about educational equity, it is within the viewpoint and the framework that you see depicted in the meme. I define equity as giving children, giving adults who are learners what they need to succeed, not just giving equal resources. What also matters in discussions of equity is whose viewpoint dominates, whose lens decides what is normal, what is acceptable, and what will be supported by social structures. The importance of more than one standardized view is critical. The image you see here is from my personal collection, given to me by my father, and it depicts an early school for African American children. I was told that the school was somewhere in Caldwell County, shortly after the turn of the 20th century. I cannot identify any of the subjects in the photograph, but I was told that it was a Caldwell County school. Keep in mind that teaching these children whom you see in this picture, teaching their parents and their grandparents, who were probably enslaved people, to read, was always strongly discouraged during slavery. It eventually became illegal to teach blacks to read in the South. Why? Because education has long been tied to and associated with freedom and citizenship. The fear was that if blacks learned to read, they could read, for example, parts of the Bible you didn't want them to read. They could read abolitionist publications. They could get ideas. They could try to revolt against their conditions of servitude. For more context around this idea, I recommend that you watch a video that is linked to this lesson. It's called The Calling and the Courage, the History of African American Education. This particular video will give you a longitudinal view of the history of education as it relates to black people, from when blacks first arrived in America as indentured servants all the way up to post-Brown v. Board of Education. That history will undergird and explain in large part where our society is today. You're looking at two more pictures from my personal family genealogy collection. The man that you see in this image to the left is my great-grandfather. His name was Edward Vine Dula. He was born just months after the Emancipation Proclamation to a formerly enslaved woman and her owner. He and his brother Grant were literate, and they were the first blacks to serve as members of the Caldwell County School Board. They sold land to the school board for $1, they and their wives, and then they put in the work to help build one of the first public schools for black children in the county. That school served and was attended by children from communities within probably about a 10-mile radius. This is only one story that exemplifies the importance placed on education by African Americans after having been deprived by law of the right to learn. They understood the connections not only between citizenship and democracy and literacy, but they also understood the connection between their own economic viability or vitality and education, literacy. Even beyond that, they knew that there was a link between literacy, education, and their own sense of self-worth and value. So these folks knew that in order for their children and grandchildren to have a better life than they had to be educated. They also knew that their ancestors, the ones who had come before them, had largely been denied the benefits of literacy. And without changing that, without enabling their children and their future, their posterity, to complete education and to gain the benefits of education, their descendants had no chance of participating in the American Democratic Project. When you think about the ties that education has to citizenship, to democracy, to wealth building, to health disparities and outcomes, it's easy to see that education is an inherently political enterprise. Just to continue the discussion of generational impacts on African American families, you're looking at a graduation photo of my mother. Rosa Forney Dula. She graduated from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, which was later known as A&T University in Greensboro. In 1946, she completed a degree in home economics education. She was a member of another generation of young Black people who chose the profession and career of education for the purpose of pursuing racial uplift, to try to improve the social, economic, all the conditions surrounding the life of Black people in the United States. If you will look to the right, the image that you see of a letter was sent to my mother about 3 years after she graduated from college. It's from Catherine T. Dennis, who was the State Director of Home Economics Education. Dated June 20th, 1949, the letter says, "Dear Miss Forney, your name is in the files for recommendation for vacancies, but to date, I have not had any requests for Negro home economics teachers. Yours truly, Catherine T. Dennis." While this letter may sound a little strange to contemporary ears, it was very much the norm during Jim Crow, during the period after Reconstruction and prior to the Civil Rights Movement. My mother waited, as was the process, for 3 years to hear of an appointment to serve as a home economics teacher somewhere in the state of North Carolina, where she would have had to move. And during the course of that time, nothing had come open. Having to live and work to maintain her life, she took on other work and never became a teacher. Just like with primary and secondary education, higher education was denied to most African Americans who largely could not attend the PWIs, primarily white institutions, prior to the Civil Rights Movement. We often lift and elevate W.E.B. Du Bois, and as well we should, for his accomplishments and his ability to graduate from a prestigious white university. But he was definitely the exception and not the rule. Segregation and the denial of higher education to Blacks, deprivation of the right to pursue higher education, all these things led to the establishment of America's historically Black colleges and universities. A tradition that proudly continues to this day. It was necessary to create historically Black universities and colleges because Blacks could not attend primarily white institutions or predominantly white institutions. In the year 1896, a well-known case came out of the Supreme Court called Plessy versus Ferguson, and that case effectively established Jim Crow law in the South that said that while Blacks were entitled to public accommodations, they were not to be in the same space as white people. So it established the doctrine of separate but equal. Black folks were to have public accommodations, but they were to be separate from white people's accommodations, but they were supposed to be equal to those accommodations. That second part didn't happen. The equal to piece did not manifest. And several years later, 1954, less than a decade after my mother graduated from an HBCU with her teaching degree, Brown versus Board of Education came before the United States Supreme Court, giving them the opportunity to reverse the law that was made the structure of the land through Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in public schools, and it effectively began the end of the Jim Crow era in the South and de facto segregation in the North, because even though they weren't under Jim Crow law, the North was also segregated. So to me, it's very relevant and remarkable that the discipline and practice of education is the legal structure, the legal venue, the legal system in which America first began to dismantle segregation, in which it first was successfully challenged and broken. But, excuse me, Brown versus Board of Education ushered in the modern civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s, continuing on up into the 1970s in some cases. And the case also set precedent for the dismantling of segregation in all public arenas and accommodations. This is a collage of photographs of myself and my youngest son in our caps and gowns when we both graduated more than 3 decades apart from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I present these photos to you as a counter narrative to what we most often hear about blacks in higher education and in primary and secondary education as well. The achievement gap, deficit discourses around black, indigenous, and other people of color. The idea of the achievement gap was around back in my day, years and years ago, and it has survived unto the present time. Most people have heard the term enough that they would feel fairly confident in venturing a guess as to what it means, maybe even adding some thoughts about what causes it. And it would probably go something sort of like this. The achievement gap means that black learners and other learners of color don't do as well in school as white learners. Even though most people aren't very well versed in exactly what it is that BIPOC learners don't do as well, there's a general sense of their academic inferiority and lower capacity than white kids and white learners. Along with that sense of inherent inferiority, often comes the belief that the difference between white kids and kids of color is natural, that white kids are just smarter. Other assumptions that come with the package are that children of color, and particularly black children, live in environments that are antithetical to learning, that they have parents who are not supportive, that disciplinary issues prevent educational attainment, and there are a host of other reasons and explanations given for the disparity between the learning outcomes of white children, white children and children of color. Now, of course, these are stereotypes, and every stereotype is true of someone, but no stereotype is true of everyone. Some of the problems that are caused and made evident through the achievement gap reflect systemic inequities rather than personal actions. Some of them reflect systemic inequities along with personal responsibility. What the research has not done so well until recently is to try to look at the potential intersection between institutional shortcomings and personal shortcomings. The assumption that the fault and the responsibility for lower learning outcomes rests squarely on the shoulders of people of color is what's called deficit discourse. These are negative ideas that serve as the basis of, at this point, decades of research-based educational interventions that were intended to close the education gap, the achievement gap, by looking at and then fixing what's wrong in communities of color. Sounds like it should work, right? Well, interventions based on deficit discourses and what's wrong with you, what's wrong with your community, what's wrong with your environment, have barely moved the needle in the achievement gap over the last 40 years. Contemporary education researchers present a variety of alternative paradigms that combine the true statistical realities of the achievement gap with interventions that are more reflective of the positive aspects of the cultures of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And these models, these frameworks are showing some promising outcomes. They are what's called anti-deficit discourses, okay? And they are, as I said, showing some promising outcomes. You may hear of things like studies of educational resiliency. You may hear of ideas such as culturally responsive pedagogy or culturally responsive teaching that are being used in educational settings and that are making learning more accessible. And with learning being more accessible, more relevant to BIPOC learners, the learning outcomes are hoped to move forward, hoped to improve. So that's where the discussion is in general terms around the achievement gap currently. Across the country, school boards and legislative bodies are fighting and grappling with how to talk about race and racism as part of America's history and as an element of its current functions and condition. The death of George Floyd in the middle of a pandemic lockdown brought questions before the nation with an intensity and under circumstances that could not be ignored. Institutions and employers responded by requiring workers to be trained in matters of cultural competency, diversity, equity, inclusion, a host of other names that garnered the attention and anger of a more conservative demographic, which then began to push back against ideas like anti-racism and woke culture. The president then issued an executive order banning DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings for federal contractors and employees in alignment with the ideas of a conservative activist and journalist named Christopher Rufo. Christopher Rufo promoted the idea that critical race theory was behind the push for racial reckoning in America. According to a June 18, 2021 article published in The New Yorker, which is linked to this lesson for your reading, Rufo saw critical race theory as, quote, the perfect villain, his words, end quote, in the culture war. Rufo now hosts a website called CRT Tracker, where he follows legislation to restrict or ban critical race theory. There are other websites, many websites related to this issue, one of which in particular tracks where critical race theory is being taught in schools around the country from every level, at every level. In an article updated on February 8, 2022, Education Week reports that 37 states have introduced bills or taken other steps in an attempt to regulate how race and racism are being taught in the schools. 4 states have actually passed legislation that bans critical race theory, bans an academic theory. I recommend that you watch the brief video that's linked to this lesson. It tells a bit more about the current debates around critical race theory and a little bit about their origin in a very brief, bite-sized way. The ultimate question remains, as American students learn about the German Holocaust, as they learn about South African apartheid, what will they learn about America's engagement with race? So we end the presentation basically where we began, somewhere at the intersection of education, law, history, and personal experience. I want to thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts with you, particularly for allowing me to share from my lived experiences as an African American woman. My frame of reference is not intended to marginalize or disregard the experiences of members of any other race. It is simply to allow me to speak from the standpoint with which I am most familiar. There are more stories to be told that reflect other views of education, race, and equity, and I encourage you to hear those stories. Thanks again.